EVO.
Dr. Charles Leale was a 23-year-old Union Army surgeon on the night that President Lincoln was assassinated. He had bought himself a ticket to Our American Cousin not to see the play, but to catch a glimpse of the president. Dr. Leale was a great admirer of Lincoln and had attended his final speech from the White House balcony 3 days earlier. When it was announced that Lincoln would be in attendance at Ford's Theater on the evening of the 14th, the young doctor jumped at the chance to simply be in the same room as the president. Leale was aware, as many were, that he was living in times of incredible historical significance. Little did he know of the role he would play in making history that evening at the theater. Welcome back to the Ides of April. I'm Alec Baldwin. Episode 4, To the Ages. By the time Dr. Leale arrived at the box office, the pickings were rather slim. Mostly obstructed view seating was left for purchase. On this particular evening, however, the obstructed view seat actually provided an advantage for the doctor. The ticket allowed an unfettered view of the presidential box. He was able to watch Lincoln as Lincoln watched the play. Dr. Leale was snapped out of his reverie the moment he heard the shot and ensuing commotion. He watched in horror with the rest of the stunned audience as Booth landed on the stage brandishing a bloody dagger before running off. The screams of the First Lady summoned Dr. Leale immediately to the second floor of the theater. Fearing the worst, he wasted no time. Upon arriving at the outer door to the presidential box, the doctor was met by a handful of men, including the Presidential Guard, as they attempted to gain access. Precious seconds were ticking by. They had no way of knowing that on the other side of that door they would find a grievously wounded Major Rathbone, a mortally wounded President Lincoln, and his wife Mary Todd cradling her dying husband. Major Rathbone's wife, Clara Harris, was also in the box, furiously attempting to stem the flow of the blood gushing from her husband's arm. Among the group that first entered the box was Dr. Leale and actress Laura Keene. Very quickly, there were far too many people inside. It became a suffocating, claustrophobic atmosphere. The situation in the small box mirrored the chaos occurring in the theater below. Confusion, panic, too many people, and not enough room to maneuver. No one seemed to be in charge because no one was. For his part, Dr. Leale, who had become a licensed practitioner just 6 weeks earlier, never hesitated. He began his examination of the president at once. A cursory physical exam showed extremely labored breathing and a barely detectable pulse rate. Dr. Leale remembered the dagger that Booth was holding on stage, but was unable to find any stab wounds. Incredibly, he also found no blood on the president. As the doctor continued his examination, he found it difficult to loosen the president's necktie. He was handed a penknife to cut the tie loose. That was when he noticed blood on Lincoln's shoulder. Leale removed the president's jacket and shirt, but still found no wounds that would explain his condition. Leale moved on to Lincoln's scalp, combing his fingers through the president's hair until, at last, he found it. A bullet hole at the base of Lincoln's skull, to the left of the spine. The tissue surrounding the hole was swollen, and a large clot was preventing blood flow. Dr. Leale removed the clot with his fingers. The president's pulse, as well as his breathing, stabilized. That small bit of relief did nothing to comfort Dr. Leale's knowledge that President Lincoln's wound was indeed fatal. He doubted the president would survive the night. They needed somewhere close by so that the president could be comfortable for his last hours on Earth. Around the same time, a calm and debonair gentleman was approaching the guards on Navy Yard Bridge, which connected Washington City with Uniontown, Maryland. Because of the war, all bridges and ferry crossings that connected Washington City had been under general order for the past 2 years. The order effectively closed off the city from entry or exit between 9 p.m. and daylight. Silas Cobb was a 26-year-old station guard or sentry on the night of April 14th. Now that the war was officially over, Cobb surely was counting the days until his discharge and likely had his guard down. So when this unknown rider approached, Cobb asked only the most basic of questions. "Friend or foe?" "Friend," replied the unknown rider. "Name?" It was here that this mystery man took a risk. He'd bet on the fact that he was still riding ahead of the news of what he had just done. He used his real name. "John Booth," he said calmly. We can assume that Silas Cobb was familiar with the name, and as he led Booth's horse into the light of the guardhouse, in all likelihood recognized the face of the famous actor. "What kept you in the city this late? You're aware you're asking to cross after hours." We can imagine the flash of a grin across Booth's face. It was not unlike the drunken bar patron less than an hour before, Booth exclaiming about how famous he'd be when he left the stage. Booth had a similar response to Cobb's question about the lateness of the hour. "Well, I recently completed a stage engagement and thought I'd have the moon." Stage engagement indeed. Booth also mentioned that he was on his way to Charles County in southern Maryland. Cobb noticed the bright moon that hung over Washington, illuminating the rider's journey into Maryland. Booth's story checked out, and Cobb allowed him to pass without further delay. While Booth seemed collected and respectful, Cobb did notice that the actor's horse seemed particularly distressed and riled up. The animal was unable to hide that it had been ridden hard. Minutes later, a less sophisticated rider approached. He gave his name as Smith after announcing himself as a friend to Cobb. Booth's co-conspirator had arrived, and Davy Harold wasn't nearly as sure that the evening's earth-shattering news hadn't reached the Navy Yard bridge. Harold wasn't taking any chances. Davy wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't elegantly dressed, and he didn't speak with the flair and theatrics that Booth commanded. In fact, when asked what kept him so late in the city, Davy answered with a lewd comment about being with a woman on Capitol Hill. Despite the standing order, Cobb allowed the man to cross as well. It wouldn't be too long before Silas Cobb was informed that he had unwittingly allowed 2 men involved in the assassination of the President of the United States to leave the city. And surely by first light, they could be anywhere. Back at Ford's Theater, Dr. Leale had already made the decision that Lincoln wouldn't survive a hasty carriage ride back to the White House. Other physicians in attendance agreed. There were several doctors there at the theater that night, and several more that would tend to the president throughout the evening. Leale, however, was the first doctor to be at Lincoln's side after the attack, and he would be the man holding the president's hand as he took his final breath. A group of men raised Abraham Lincoln above their heads and made their way downstairs to the main lobby of the theater. Dr. Leale ran ahead, desperate for an answer of where to take the fallen president. By now, a large crowd had gathered in the street outside the theater. Word had spread about the condition of President Lincoln. As Dr. Leale craned his neck to see above the crowd, he heard a man calling out. Across the street from Ford's Theater stands the Peterson House. A man renting one of the rooms recognized the need for a sanctuary to treat the wounded president. "Bring him here," the man shouted. Dr. Leale instructed a uniformed soldier to clear a path. Within moments, the comatose body of Abraham Lincoln was laid diagonally across the bed in a back room of the Peterson House. Guards were posted at the front door, and thus Leale could perform a proper examination as messengers were sent across the city to summon Lincoln's faithful to say their final goodbyes to their president. As for the other members of Booth's terror plot, both men would only briefly evade capture during the first several days of the manhunt. George Atzerodt, the would-be killer of Vice President Andrew Johnson, was tracked to the home of a cousin in Germantown, Maryland, and taken into custody on April 20th. Lewis Powell, the man who wreaked havoc at the Seward residence, was arrested 3 days later at Surratt's boarding house. Disguised as a day laborer, Powell had the misfortune of arriving at Mary Surratt's doorstep just as federal investigators were concluding their interviews with Mary and others at her house. Booth and Davy Harold met up at a predetermined spot called Soper's Hill, about 5 miles outside of the city. We can imagine the conversation. Booth, triumphant in his attack on Lincoln and curious of the missing Powell's success or failure. Harold, having fled the scene to screams of murder, undoubtedly told Booth that Seward had been killed. Harold also informed Booth that almost certainly Powell had been captured. As for George Atzerodt, neither had any way of knowing whether or not his mission at Andrew Johnson's residence was a success. Despite Harold's protests, Booth assured Harold that the men knew the risks. It was far too dangerous to wait for the compatriots. Booth and Harold pressed on. Their next stop would be at a nearby tavern and former country home of Mary Surratt. The tavern was rented by a man named John Lloyd. Lloyd was a Confederate sympathizer. He was also the man Booth had sent Mary to see early that same morning with a message. They would need guns and food, and no questions asked. Lloyd was happy to oblige. It was near midnight as two of the most wanted men in the brief history of the United States arrived at the tavern. Davy dismounted and stepped inside the tavern to gather supplies. It's here that one of the greatest mysteries of the Lincoln assassination comes sharply into focus. Booth didn't join Davy as he went inside to fetch Lloyd because he couldn't. He was unable to walk. He could barely ride. Sometime between when the fatal shot was fired and his arrival at Lloyd's tavern, Booth had sustained a grievously broken left leg. This dispute begins with these words from Booth's own journal.
I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends, was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted "Sic Semper" before I fired. In jumping, broke my leg. Passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night, with the bone of my leg tearing the flesh at every jump. I can never repent it.
Booth is referring, it would seem, to his leap from the presidential box to the stage. It was reported that as he jumped, the spur on Booth's left boot became caught on the presidential bunting draped across the front balcony. Off balance, Booth landed awkwardly on the stage. In contrast, historian Michael W. Kaufman offers several points to consider. No eyewitness from Ford's Theater recalled Booth limping as he fled the stage. No witness on the street that evening noted Booth having trouble mounting his horse, which would have required heavy strain on his left leg. And finally, Silas Cobb, the sentry at the Navy Yard Bridge, also made no mention of Booth being in any pain or discomfort. Weeks later, during interrogation, Davy Harold claimed that once they met up at Soper's Hill, Booth admitted that he had injured his leg when thrown from his horse. Perhaps that's what Booth meant when he wrote, "In jumping, broke my leg." Maybe it was the horse that was doing the jumping and Booth was thrown. Either way, this injury would prove to have major significance in the following days, and not just for Booth and Harold.
It was really a plot to decapitate the federal government. It was like a terrorist attack on the federal government.
Author Walter Starr.
We're absolutely sure that the targets included Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State Seward. And we're reasonably sure that they also were hoping to kill Secretary of War Stanton and General Ulysses Grant. And who knows whether they planned to kill others. One of the first things that Stanton did when he arrived at the Peterson house and took charge on maybe midnight on the 14th, 15th, was he ordered guards placed at the houses of all of the leaders of the Union, including Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. Chase writes in his diary about staying awake all night, listening to the rain drop and listening to the marching of the guards outside his house. He describes it in his diary as a night of horror.
The story continues after the break. Back in Washington City, the cogs of a still functioning government were thrust into high gear. Among the government's top priorities were sequestering Vice President Andrew Johnson. The VP was to be kept under heavy guard until he could be sworn in as the 17th President of the United States. Meanwhile, at the Peterson boarding house, more than 100 people made their way to the decidedly unpresidential bedroom to say their final goodbyes to Abraham Lincoln. Attendees included cabinet members, judges, members of Congress, military personnel, as well as close friends and family. By this point, a grief-stricken Mary Todd Lincoln had been removed from the room. She was inconsolable, and through her sobs, she begged to take the place of her dying husband. It was an appeal directly to God. She, like Booth, was willing to trade her life for the president's. The quiet afforded by her absence allowed Dr. Leale to perform a thorough diagnosis, which he delivered to Surgeon General Joseph Barnes immediately upon his arrival at Lincoln's bedside. The news was devastating. The .44 caliber ball fired from Booth's single-shot Derringer pistol had entered near the base of Lincoln's skull, approximately midway between his left ear and his spine, slightly below the ear line. The bullet had ripped through both hemispheres of the brain and lodged behind the right eye. Leale noted that Lincoln's left eye was slightly dilated, but his right eye was bulging with severe bruising extending beyond the cheekbone. All subsequent physicians who attended to Lincoln that evening agreed with Dr. Leale's original prognosis. President Lincoln's life was quickly expiring. It would be miraculous if he survived till morning. The doctors who examined Lincoln that night were astounded at the physical specimen the 56-year-old man presented. They noted Lincoln's arms, chest, and overall musculature were that of a seasoned athlete. If not for his incredible fitness, it's doubtful Lincoln would have lasted more than 10 minutes after the attack. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was awoken by the news of the violence that had exploded that evening in Washington City. Lincoln, they were told, was in much worse shape. It was recommended that Secretary Stanton and Wells get to the Peterson house as soon as they could. Dr. Leale straightened in his chair at the mere mention of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. It was only hours earlier that Leale was content to catch a glimpse of Lincoln at Ford's Theater for nothing more than bragging rights back home in New York. Now he found himself in the unimaginable position of being the main physician in charge of a dying American president. Even the Surgeon General wouldn't demand Leale relinquish his spot at the bedside, holding Lincoln's hand. Dr. Leale would later write about that moment at Lincoln's side. Quote, "Knowledge that frequently, just before departure, recognition and reason return to those who have been unconscious, caused me for several hours to hold the President's right hand firmly within my grasp, to let him in his blindness know, if possible, that he was in touch with humanity and had a friend." Lincoln, the leader of men, the great emancipator, had transformed from a position of immortality in the eyes of the young doctor to, tragically, exceptionally mortal. Dr. Leale looked up as War Secretary Stanton entered the room along with Secretary Wells. One could imagine the doctor also took note of the other powerful occupants of the room. Quartermaster General Meigs of the Union Army, District of Columbia Chief Justice David Carter, the Surgeon General, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, and for the time being the President of the United States. For 10 hours that night, a small bedroom in a boarding house on 10th Street became the seat of American democracy. As Stanton entered, Surgeon General Barnes whispered in confidence, "Mr. Lincoln cannot recover." Stanton acknowledged the devastating news and took a seat beside his dying friend. Then, in great contrast to what anyone would have expected from Stanton, the god of war yielded to his overwhelming grief. He sobbed uncontrollably for several minutes. But there was work to be done. It was treated as factual that the actor John Wilkes Booth had shot the president. He was priority one in all citywide dispatches. Booth was to be apprehended immediately. Orders were given to effectively shut down Washington City. All roads, bridges, trains, carriages, horses, and persons on foot were to be stopped and searched, and all persons interrogated. New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore were also notified to monitor all points of entry and given the same investigative orders. All boats were to be stopped, boarded, and officials were directed to arrest everyone on board. Everyone on board every boat leaving the vicinity of Washington City was to be arrested. One directive from Stanton concerning a particular crossing read, "Arrest every man, woman, and child attempting to pass." It bears mentioning that at this point the writ of habeas corpus had been suspended for nearly 3 years. This unprecedented act by Abraham Lincoln allowed the government, specifically the military, to arrest and hold anyone at any time for any reason, for as long as they wanted. The order would be challenged in court, and the Lincoln administration would eventually prevail. The lasting effects of the order will be explored in a later episode, but suffice it to say that Edwin Stanton availed himself of these awesome powers with impunity. Although deeply affected by the news of the evening, he was shaken to his core. War Secretary Stanton rallied, and within hours was all business. All prominent military officers, judges, and elected officials were given 24-hour protection until Stanton could be sure that the threat had passed. No one knew how deep the conspiracy went. As Lincoln lay dying, Booth's master plan was unraveling. His injured leg required immediate attention, which meant a major change of plans. Booth was improvising now. But despite his extensive experience as an actor, Booth had little experience with improvisation because he always worked off a script. Throughout the rest of that night, as rain began to fall on the gathered crowd outside the Peterson house, efforts were made to prevent further bloodshed. Secretary Stanton orchestrated a massive search for those responsible for the impending death of his boss and friend. Lincoln's miraculous resilience caused anguish for those at his bedside. They all knew the end was near, and the minutes and hours crept by at an excruciating pace. Colonel Woodward felt compelled to stop by the Peterson house on his way home and elegantly described the scene of Lincoln and his labored breathing. Every now and then the sounds would cease, and for a moment or two it would seem as if the end had come. Then they would begin again, and the failing flame of life would feebly flicker on. These false alarms, when the president's breathing would stop for long periods of time, became more frequent as a pale sun rose on the morning of the 15th. At 7:22 a.m., Lincoln's breathing stopped for good. Several minutes of silence befell the room as the gravity of the situation sunk in. Edwin Stanton stepped into that silence and spoke his brief but immortal eulogy. Now he belongs to the ages. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, the victor, was dead. Like so many young men in the previous years, he had paid the ultimate price for his country. Stanton sent for the necessary items to have the president's body transported back to the White House. Minutes later, a plain open wagon arrived with a simple pine box, the coffin and transport of a commoner. It was all that was available for immediate use, but everyone knew that Lincoln wouldn't have minded. After all, what more should be expected for a humble rail splitter? The coffin was brought into the room, the body was placed inside, and the lid secured. The coffin was loaded onto the wagon in front of a somber crowd that had swelled to several thousand mourners. The wagon pulled away as a light rain persisted through the gray dawn of April 15th. Lincoln's suffering was over, and the national mourning could begin. Secretary Stanton spent several minutes alone in the room where Lincoln died, no doubt planning the next steps of what would become the largest manhunt the nation had ever seen. That 6-word eulogy he delivered would be his last full measure of eloquence for some time, for the vengeance of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would now take center stage. On the next episode, Booth's escape hits a roadblock as he settles in for the lost week with some help from friends old and new. Meanwhile, as his frustration grows, Stanton considers the next move in his fervor to apprehend the assassin John Wilkes Booth. That's next time on the Ides of April. The Ides of April was created, produced, and written by Brandon Morgan. Our executive producers are Brandon Morgan and Matt Del Piano. Zach McNeese is our story editor, sound designer, and mixer. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thanks for listening.